I just talked to you guys for like a whole 30 seconds with my mic on mute. Go me. Um, uh, welcome back, guys. We have Debbie Frost here. She was the horticulture agent before me and before Jeff Floyd. And she can tell you a little bit more about herself. But yeah, she's here to talk to you guys about recommended plants. You ready, Debbie?
I'm ready. And
Right.
this is so exciting. Thank you, Jeanette. And this is so exciting to do something different and to do a different kind of presentation. And I wish I could be there to see y'all and to meet you and to interact with you in person, but it is what it is, and we're just going to make the best of it. So so yes, I was the horticulture agent for 23 years in Ector and Midland counties. Wonderful job, wonderful job. And one of the best things about my job was the Master Gardener program. It's a lovely program. It is a very rewarding program for, it was for me, for, I believe for Master Gardeners and for our community. And so I really cannot say enough good things about the Master Gardener program. So I hope y'all will enjoy the entire experience. And then once you get your training and your certification, that you'll just hang in there and be totally involved in the program, because it's extremely rewarding and helpful to our community. So today I'm going to be talking about recommended plants. And I love to talk about plants. I'm a crazy plant person. And in addition to talking about plants, I love to talk about the horticultural care of those plants. So as well as the various uses and different ways you can use plants. So, but first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about how important it is to consider the mature height and the spread of plant material. Because when you're planting a landscape, or I don't know about you, but I go down to the garden center and always something follows me home. And so then you have to figure out where you're going to put it. So that's important information to know, is where you're going to put that plant, and is it going to fit, and is it going to fulfill its potential in your landscape. So plants are lumped into dwarf, small, medium, and large categories, or at least woody plant material is, because there's just so many within a category, and we'll talk about that. So you can see from this picture in the slide that shade trees get quite large, and that they can provide cooling shade to your home, the inside parts of your home, as well as the outdoor living spaces of your home. And so they really serve vital service to the landscape. Shrubbery can be used for screening. It can be used for backdrop. Ground cover can be used as a transition from the lawn space to the house. And so they just have a lot of different roles. And so we'll talk about some of those roles. So first I want to start off with this is a demonstration garden that was designed by the Dallas County Master Gardeners, and it was next to the maintenance, the county maintenance yard. And so you can see all of this stuff in the backdrop of this beautiful little garden space. So the first thing are these big Nellie R. Stevens hollies, these evergreens that will provide shade, screening to the maintenance area, as well as a dark green backdrop that can be used to showcase the plants in front of that backdrop. Also, there's a lot of plant material. So there's just layers of plant material in this demonstration garden. And so in mass, the lamb's ear has been planted in mass. And so you can see quite a few of them. along the front of the garden. And so anytime you repeat a species, you get a better look than if you use one of everything. Now, my tendency is to have one of everything, but that will always end up being a weedy, choppy look to the landscape. So you do need to plant in mass, and you need to repeat your species for the best look in your landscape. But so these master gardeners did a great job of massing the plant material, and you can see this mass of sedum, probably autumn joy sedum, and then they did a mass planting of the Salvia gregii. So that gives you a much better look than one of everything. Here is a variegated society garlic. They did a nice mass planting. And so they used good principles in this little demonstration garden. Now, just because I'll forget to mention this to you, the best time for planting woody trees and shrubs, those trees and shrubs that are winter hardy for our zone 8A zone that we live in, is fall. So October and November are ideal months to be planting, because when you plant those woody plants, even though they're not growing, once you plant them properly into the soil, they're going to have good root growth, because our winters are still, our fall and winters have ideal soil temperatures to promote good root growth. So you're going to have good root growth, and that plant is going to be well established before the heat of summer comes the following year, which is a very hard time for plants to establish and to grow well. So fall is good, even winter is good, spring is good. I do a lot of planting in the wintertime. So if you're planting something that's winter hardy and will go through our winters, then even winter is a good time to be planting. Although you can plant in the summer, lots of people do plant in the summer. It's a little more challenging. You're more likely to lose plant material unless you're really diligent about follow-up care, which you should be anyway, but I'm terrible at it. So I have to plant in the fall and the winter to get the best results from my vegetable, from my garden, period, whether that's vegetable or ornamental. I thought you might need a face to go along with the voice. So I'm not a great vegetable gardener, but these artichokes are making me look good. But artichokes do really well here. So if you have never tried to grow artichokes, well, this fall, late summer, fall, go down to your local garden center. They sell artichokes in 4-inch pots. So get you, get you 2 or 3 and plant those in your garden. And they are cool season perennial vegetable. So they are beautiful through the winter months. As long as we have, suitable growing conditions, they have tremendous foliage in the winter months. And then at this time of year, they form these edible flower buds. And so try your hand at artichokes. They're really super easy. So now this is my wannabe garden person. I want a Iron Man exoskeleton, so I can tote and carry bags of mulch and compost, and I can prune trees just by, I can just climb the tree and plant them. But anyway, so the R&D is not done on this suit yet. So it's not on the market quite yet, but hang in there, because I suspect my aching knees and your aching knees could benefit from a little external help in the garden. Okay, so the first category. Now be sure, if you have a question, be sure to get it out there, because I'm happy to help. I'm happy to answer questions, and a lot of times questions clear up confusion that I've created. So help me out with some questions. So here we have a human profile in a garden with various types of ground covers. So we're going to start out by talking about ground covers. And there's all kinds of ground covers. and they serve a very good transition between the lawn or the hardscape to the next size plant or to a house, or they fulfill many different roles. So they can be used on slopes. They're excellent. The shade tolerant ones are excellent in dense shade under like a live oak tree. They help prevent soil erosion. They're really excellent in narrow planters. Oftentimes builders create these beds that are only about a foot wide, and there are no shrubs that fit in a 1 foot planter. So you can use a ground cover in there, and they range from a few inches in height to sometimes 2 or 3 feet. They can be evergreen. They can have flowers. They do require maintenance. So ground covers are not maintenance free. Ground covers take 2 to 3 years. Not all of them, but some of them take, like a slower woody growing ground cover is going to take 2 or 3 years to get a well-established and a complete coverage. But once they're established, they do require less water than turf grass and certainly less maintenance. First ground cover I'd like to talk about is frog fruit. So frog fruit is an excellent little ground cover. It spreads by rooting. So you can start off with just a few plants, and they will spread by an above ground runner, a stolon, and they will root and establish and spread. And they have small green leaves. In the summertime, they have these small flowers. And once it's established, it's very drought tolerant. It'll grow in sun or shade. But you do need to, I would recommend that you grow frog fruit in a contained area. Do not put it in with your shrubs and your perennials. If you do put it in a bed with those other plants, we'll put a piece of steel edging between it and your shrubs and your perennials so that you're not having to dig and pull and weed the frog fruit out of your beds. You can run a string trimmer or a hedge trimmer along the edge of the steel edging occasionally to keep it out of your other plants. But otherwise, it's a great plant to substitute for let a bed of ground cover. So frog fruit is a great one to use. Pigeonberry is another. Now let me just back up and tell you, frog fruit is deciduous, so it goes brown in the wintertime. And then in February, you need to trim it down with a hedge trimmer, a weed eater, or even a lawnmower on a high setting. Pigeonberry is not as vigorous as frog fruit. So you can have it in with your beds and it's not going to become a nuisance. It's also kind of short-lived. It kind of comes and goes. It comes up from seed, or you can buy it in plants, little 4-inch pots in the nursery trade. It has little pink flowers, and those flowers turn into red fruit. The birds love the fruit, so it's an excellent, if you like to encourage birds in your landscape, it's an excellent one to bring into your landscape. It's a pretty little plant. It only gets about maybe a foot tall, and in the winter or in the fall, right before in cool temperatures, the leaves turn burgundy. And then it just goes away. But it's a root hardy perennial, so it will come back in the springtime from the root system, but the top will kind of disappear. Now, a plant that can be used as a ground cover that doesn't disappear is trailing rosemary. It's evergreen, it's woody, it also has culinary use. It has blue flowers in late winter, and it can be grown in sun or shade, and it'll get 1 to 3 feet tall. So it's really good in a raised bed. It makes a great cascading effect in the landscape. So it's quite beautiful and quite useful in the landscape. Now, trailing rosemary is a little bit winter tender in our area. So in real cold winters, we will lose it or it'll be damaged by the cold. But it's other than that, occasionally happening, it's extremely useful in the landscape. Annalena is a very nice ground cover. And actually there are two very useful species of Sannalina. There's a green Sannalina, which is Sannalina virens, and this is the one that's in the picture, as you can see. And you can see it's a very fine textured, bright green plant. It's super useful in the landscape. It can be used as a dwarf shrub if you would like. And it needs to be grown in well-drained soils. It's very drought tolerant. If you water it too much, you'll lose it. And you should, it doesn't need any fertilizing. So in February, it needs to be sheared or cut back so that it doesn't become too overgrown and too woody in the landscape. So you'll want, every February, you'll want to prune it back some so that it stays a nice form in the landscape. The other Sannalina, which I don't have a picture of, but you're probably familiar with it, is Sannalina camiciferus. I think I probably didn't say that right. Chamidroides. Anyway, it's one of those. It's the gray Sannalina, also very fine textured. Both of these Sannalinas bloom in the summertime with small, round, yellow blooms. And so after the blooms are no longer attractive, it would benefit to just do a tip shearing to shear those off and keep your plant nice and tidy. Now, the next ground cover is Woolly Stomodia. And Woolly Stomodia is just a beautiful ground cover. It's underutilized and it's hard to find. I'm not sure why it's hard to find, because I think it's easy to propagate, because this is one of those ground covers that will root. The stems will root on the ground and it'll just sort of get bigger and bigger. It's not overly aggressive. It's semi-evergreen. It's very drought tolerant. It's just it likes full sun, but it will tolerate a fair amount of shade. I had it under a cedar elm in my last landscape, and it did extremely well. And I really encourage you to look for Woolly Stomodia. And now Woolly Stomodia, I don't know if you can tell by the smaller picture, but the leaves and the stems are covered in small little hairs. And so anytime you have a plant where the leaves are covered in hairs, that gives it a very drought resistant quality, because it slows down the loss of water from the plant. So, you know, when a plant takes up water, the water is taken up by the roots, it goes into the stems, it goes into the leaves, and then the majority of it, 99% or 98% or a very large percent, goes into the atmosphere. Well, on a hot, windy day, that transpiration rate, the loss of water, is very rapid. And so a plant can lose water at such a rate that it depletes the soil of water, and that plant begins to shut down because it doesn't have any water. A plant that's growing like Woolly Stomodia, that has these hairs covering the leaves and the stems, that the loss of water is really slows down. So the transpiration rate slows down. The plant is better suited for hot, dry, windy conditions. So it's a great feature in xeric type plants. Another really nice little ground. Now this is a small ground cover, and it only spreads maybe 2 feet wide. It gets 2 to 8 inches or 2 to 6 inches or so tall, and it'll get maybe as much as 2 feet in diameter. It's very fine textured, and that's creeping germander. And it has very fragrant foliage. So if you're working, like if you're weeding or clipping or deadheading or whatever, you get this nice fruity fragrance from the foliage when you disturb it. It's really good along the edges of beds where the sidewalk or the driveway or some hot, sunny, dry area that it intersects with. It's a good plant for those uses. Here you see one with a boulder next to a boulder, and it's very happy in a hot, dry situation, and very beautiful. And now I do see this one in the nursery trade some, so you can find this plant. Usually it's with the ground covers. It's usually in 4-inch pots, and but sometimes it's in 1-gallon pots. So look for creeping geranium. It's a lovely plant to put in your home landscape. This is just a closer fuzzy view of the flower, but on the right, you see what the foliage looks like after the flowers have faded. Still very attractive, and it goes through the winter like this as well. So it's a good, useful plant. Okay, so now we're going to move into dwarf and small shrubs. So you see the profile of a man standing in the garden, and you can see a dwarf shrub and small shrubs and how they play out in our landscape. So these are not necessarily dwarf shrubs, but shrubs are often, we bring them home in a 1-gallon pot, and they're tiny and they're cute. And then we plant them in the landscape, and then they become huge and they become a bruiser in the landscape. And so we see the use of 2 shrubs that have been planted in the home landscape. So on your left, that's a shrub called Elaeagnus, which I love Elaeagnus. It's a great plant, but it's a very large plant. So you have to be careful where you use it in the landscape, because you cannot shear this plant into submission. You can, but that's all you'll be doing. You won't get anything else done. But in the center of the picture, you see a sea green juniper. And so one is a very lovely size in the landscape. The other one is a bruiser in the landscape. So research your plants, know their expected mature height and spread, like we talked about earlier, and then put it in an appropriate place in the landscape. And here in that very same landscape, a green pittosporum was planted. One, again, probably tiny little plant, was brought into the landscape, and then pretty soon it was, it was hiding the house. You couldn't even, windows are covered up, the fireplace is covered up, maybe even doors are covered up. But instead of taking that plant out of the landscape, you could, as the treatment on the right hand, the picture on the right is a variegated pittosporum, so very similar. I mean, same genus, but maybe a different species. The plant was pruned to a small tree form, and you could do the same thing with this green pittosporum and kind of tame it and reveal the house once again, and not have to do away with this overgrown shrub, but just train it. Another thing about using shrubs is that often they get too big for the home landscape. So when that happens, we begin to prune them, and sometimes we prune them we shear them into these different shapes. And so here is a Yaupon holly that's gotten too large for this home landscape on the left, because you can see the door, the entrance to the home is right there to the right. So it's been sheared into this boxy sort of shape. And then you also see one on the right that has been sheared into a boxy shape, but they have inverted shapes. So let's just talk about that type of pruning for a minute. So here we have this Yaupon holly has been sheared where the top is broader than the base. And so what happens is the sunlight gets blocked from the lower parts. So the lower parts begin to thin out because they're not getting enough sunlight. But then the top gets broader and broader, which creates a problem in the home landscape. So this is a very common way that people prune. The top is wider than the base, but in reality, it should be the other way around. The base should be broader than the top. That way, sunlight is not blocked and the foliage maintains quality all the way down the shrub. So it should, this upside down cup is sort of an exaggerated shape, but not too much. And this way you get a shrub that keeps its lower foliage very, very well. So this can be used with hedges, and this is the proper way to prune a hedge versus this one with a broad top. And see, always the top gets broader and broader, but the sidewalk is still where it is, and so you're still having to skirt around the plant. So a much better way to prune. And then for shrubs that look best with a natural shape, we can just do selective pruning. And another thing about that is that nowadays there are lots of shrubs to pick from, and a lot of those shrubs are in the dwarf shrub category. So we do much better now by selecting plants in the dwarf shrub category to go in our home landscapes, because they're just a better fit than those in the small, medium, and large category. Okay, so shrubs, there's all these different sizes. They can be evergreen, or they can be deciduous. They can be they can have flowers sometimes, and they're extremely valuable, as already mentioned. So this is not a real common plant, but it is available to us. This is a native shrub called, it's a dwarf baccharis, and it's extremely xeric. So it can go in a landscape that's just watered occasionally, or even just gets by on rainfall, or one that you might just water once in June, once in July, once in August during the hottest parts of the month. So this is a hybrid baccharis called Starnes Thompson, and it's a male, so it's sterile. That means it doesn't produce seed, period, and it doesn't become a weed like a lot of other baccharis that we're familiar with that does. It's one that can be pruned hard. It likes full sun. It's evergreen. It's very fine textured, and you can see in this xeriscape, it's an excellent plant for bright green, fine textured dwarf shrub shape. Now, the problem with baccharis, other forms of baccharis, is that they're extremely weedy. They produce tons of seed. The seed goes everywhere. The seed often gets deposited in the pots of native plants, because this weedy plant also grows where native plants are being produced. So unless you know it, this little plant hitchhikes in your nice native plant pot that you take home, and you plant your native plant, and pretty soon this sneaky little weed starts growing. It overtakes your plant, and if you're not familiar with the plant, you're not any to the wiser, and then the plant just goes everywhere. So it's a huge weed. It's a big problem. And so be aware of baccharis. I see it in landscapes all over the place where it's either escaped or it has hitchhiked home in a native plant pot. So be aware of it, but it's a problem. Now, a very nice, again, a very native type plant is pink fairy duster, Calliandra eriophylla. This is a plant that we had out, Master Gardeners, for many years. They designed, installed, and maintained the Waterwise garden out at the CAF. And this was one of the plants that was in that garden. It was there for many years. It's a dwarf plant and quite lovely. It was semi-evergreen, it was pretty much deciduous in our garden. But anyway, in the spring and summer, it had these beautiful powder puff blooms of pink. So very drought tolerant, very lovely plant, nice size, easy to grow in the landscape. Now, there's a hybrid there's also another species of fairy duster called red fairy duster. and it's the Calliandra californica, but there's a hybrid called Sierra Star Red Fairy Duster, and it's root hardy in our area. So the tops die back, but it comes back from the root system in the growing season, and it'll get about 3 foot tall. It likes full sun, and it can get by on very, very little water. And this is a very good hummingbird plant. So an excellent one to use in the landscape. Now, neither one of these are good pictures, so I apologize for that, but this is a delightful plant. Again, a very xeric plant. It's called Black Dahlia, and it's very fine textured. It grows about 3 to 5 foot tall and wide, and super fine textured, compound leaves. In the fall, it blooms with these purple and white and yellow blooms, and it is very dramatic and very beautiful. And it is one that will get by on, once it's established, it'll get by on very little water. And so I would encourage you to look for, this is hard to find. So you would have to go to a native plant nursery, or you'd have to order it through your local nursery. Ask them to look for Black Dahlia for you, and but it's well worth the search. Another very xeric dwarf shrub is turpentine bush. This is an evergreen shrub. It is a small shrub. Once it's established, it can get by on rainfall, or you can have it on a drip system and just give it water occasionally. And this blooms in the fall with these bright yellow blooms. I call this a John Deere plant. There's several John Deere plants. My dad had collected John Deere tractors and worked on John Deere tractors. So I always think of John Deere plants when I see these colors, this color combination. And this is just a really tough, excellent plant to use in the landscape. So if you need something in your alley, so you're not having to fight the weeds, you can plant some dwarf shrubs out there like turpentine bush. It'd be an excellent one. It's evergreen, xeric, it likes full sun, it needs good drainage. And again, now this one you can find in the nursery trades. Now bear in mind, a lot of these plants I'm talking about, when you go to the nursery to purchase them, they don't look great in the pot, but if they're green and alive, I would encourage you to take them home and plant them. They'll immediately respond to being in the ground and out of a pot, and will grow with vigor. Another sort of native plant that you could use as a dwarf shrub is Mexican oregano. And this is a delightful dwarf shrub. And it'll grow in full sun or part shade. It has good drought tolerance. It has a very, very, very long bloom period. It's a lavender bloom. It's a long bloom. It's an inch long. And now and it has very fragrant foliage. This plant, when you see it in the nursery trade, which it's not common in the nursery trade, but when you do see it occasionally, it looks like the foliage of Salvia greggii. So for me, it's easy to confuse since a lot of time it's not in bloom when you go to buy it. It's just this little green plant. But if you see the name on the tag and you're familiar with it, snatch it up because it's hard to find. Also, it's best to plant this plant, if you have any control over this, in the fall, the winter, late winter, or early spring. If this plant, when it's planted in the heat of summer, it does not. It's hard for it to survive in those conditions. So winter planting or cool season planting is best for this plant. But excellent plant. Now, the only fault that I have for this plant is that The new flower, it has very long bloom period, so the new flowers are coming from the ends of the stems. And so the older flowers below, they just turn brown and they hang on. And so after a while, that gives the plant sort of a, it doesn't look as attractive. So the way I, like if I'm going to clean up the plant, the way I do that, since you can't tip shear it, or you could, but I mean, it's still putting on new flowers, so you don't want to do that. Put on your gloves, the type of gloves that have latex fingers and palms, and just take your hands and stroke on both sides of these flower stems, and the latex of your gloves will pull the brown flowers out and leave the fresh lavender ones growing. So that's how you kind of deadhead that plant and tidy it up. Another really good little xeric native, very dwarf shrub is germander, or sometimes this is called wall germander. And it is just a very small little mound. It's about maybe a foot tall and wide. It can get taller than that, wider than that, but it's a dense evergreen shrub. And it has these pink or magenta colored blooms in the springtime and early summer. And it's very drought tolerant, and it grows in full sun and part shade. Now, some of these plants that I'm showing you, if you want to go look at them, often you need to go visit a xeric or a native garden. So like maybe Sibley Learning Center or someplace like that is a good place to go and see some of these plants. Also, there's a church in Midland. It's on the west side of Midland, and it's called, let me think, it's west of the interstate. I'm not interstate. It's west of the loop 250. I'm trying to think. It'll come to me. It might be later on down in the program before I remember it. But it's a Baptist church, and they have a lot of these plants planted in their landscape. So you can go out there and look and see a lot of these plants in the landscape. Now, this is probably one that many of y'all are familiar with. This is autumn sage. This is one of my really favorite plants, and it's semi-evergreen. It only gets 2 to 3 feet tall and wide, and it has good repeat blooming. And you can tip shear this plant after it gets through blooming, sort of like maybe in June or so, you can, or July, you can tip shear it, and it'll come back in late summer with a real heavy bloom. This plant draws the hummingbirds, so it's an excellent one to put in your landscape for hummingbirds. And I think the foliage is fragrant, so I like to position it close to a pathway or the edge of the bed, so when you brush against it, it releases these aromatic oils, very, very fragrant, in my opinion. But now that same fragrance, some people hate it. So you have to take that into account and decide, are you one of those people that love it or hate it? If you don't love it so much, we'll set it back in the bed, and it's still a hugely beneficial plant in the landscape. It grows in full sun or part shade. It actually benefits from a little afternoon shade. So in February, you want to prune this back hard. Just take your hand pruners. It's a semi-woody plant. Prune it back really hard, and it'll come back lush and dense. If you don't prune it, it gets a little leggier and leggier every year, and woodier every year, and it doesn't bloom quite as dramatically. So hard pruning is a good thing. Here we are in the medium shrubs, so you can see how that equates to the human form. So we don't think about medium shrubs being that big, but they're pretty darn big. So you can see where the dwarf and the small shrub category is extremely beneficial to us in our shrinking landscapes that we have these days. So medium shrubs are excellent for using as hedges, for screening, for backdrop, because if you have a nice green backdrop for your roses or your flowering perennials, you get dramatic benefit from that flowering color with that dark green background. Or you can use them as a specimen plant Many of them are flowering. Some of them produce fruit that's good for attracting birds. And if you have a large landscape, they're really great to use in mass plantings and that sort of thing. So there's lots of variety. So one of the very, very best medium shrubs is Flame Acanthus. And Flame Acanthus is, now you can find this in the nursery trade, and I would encourage you, everybody needs one of these plants. The flowers are quite small. I blew the picture up so it looks dramatic, but honestly, they're about 1 inch long. They're very slender. They're orangey red, but this is one of the very best hummingbird plants you can put in your landscape. So position it outside your kitchen window, where when you're washing dishes, you can watch the hummingbirds, or next to your patio, so that when you're sitting on the patio, the hummingbirds will come up close. In fact, they'll buzz you to get to these plants. So it's semi-woody. It has very small leaves. It does quite well in full sun or in a great deal of shade. You'll still get some fairly good blooming. So excellent, excellent plant. Write this down on your list. Put a star beside it because it's one you'll want to have. Now this is Prada Barbados, and it's a little bit of an iffy plant because it's not very winter hardy here. So you'll want to, as soon as you find this in the nursery trade, go ahead and plant it if this is one you're wanting, so that it has all summer to grow a nice, big, substantial root system, because it's more likely to go through the winter with a well-established root system. Put it in a hot, sunny area. Put it next to some hardscape. Or another thing you can do is you can plant it, you can put flagstones around the base of the plant to help mulch it through the winter, and to help, the flagstone will draw, the sun will warm it up in the wintertime and keep it warm through the winter nights. And okay, what I'm trying to say here is that it provides some protection through the winter, and your plant is more likely to overwinter. Although the way I used to have one in my former landscape is I would sort of, before the first hard freeze, I would cut it back a little bit, take a bucket, fill it full of dry leaves, cover it and put a brick on it. And I just left it like that until about this time of year, or maybe a little bit before now. Maybe, let's see, it is May. So in about late March, I would uncover it, or April, and it's really late to come out, but many times you'll see little shoots coming up from the base. So it's winter hard. It's sometimes root hardy here. So, okay, it's real iffy, but it's beautiful and it's worth trying to grow in a hot, sunny area of your landscape. Give it plenty of room. It gets quite large, 4 to 5 feet tall and wide. So another one now this one is pretty root hardy, dependable, and this is Skyflower. So it gets quite large, like 4 to 5 feet tall and wide, and it has these arching branches that are terminated in these weeping flower masses of little tiny purple flowers. They can be blue, lavender, purple. Sometimes the purple is ringed with white, and butterflies love these plants. So it's a good nectar plant, so be sure, and it gets quite large, so, and it needs quite a bit of sun, but it'll take partial shade. In February, I cut this to the ground. Usually the branches are dead, but even if they're not completely dead, if it's been a mild winter, I usually cut them back hard to the ground to keep, control the size of the plant. So excellent, fun plant to grow, needs some space, and it blooms kind of late summer when it comes back, from the roots. Okay, another plant that is root hardy here, but very well worth growing, is Thryallis, and it has some better common names than that. One of the common names is Golden Showers, I believe is one of them. And I can't remember. There's some other common names. But this is a really nice plant. It has, as you can see from the picture, it has red stems, bright green, clean foliage, beautiful yellow flowers with red centers. And this has a tremendously long bloom period. Grow it in full sun or partial shade. Once it's established, it has good drought tolerance and just a wonderfully long bloom period. So it is a great plant to have in your landscape. Now, sometimes when you buy this in the nursery trade, the plant is a little bit floppy in the container. Now, they're doing a better and better job of propagating this plant. So I see it more and more where it has better rooting, it's better in the pot, and it's not as floppy. But plant this one as early in the growing season as you can find it in the nursery trade. So it has all summer to establish a root system. But this is a delightful plant. It gets at least 3 feet by 3 feet. So give it some space. It's not always, the top is not always dead to the root system. So you can just check it for live growth. You can take your hand pruners and just barely shape through the outer stem. And if you see green, green underneath the bark, then it's alive right there. But you can distinguish between what's dead and what's green. But I usually just prune it back pretty hard to the crown every year. Okay, Texas sage. So we're going to talk about sages for a little bit. And as y'all know, common names don't mean much. So you can't always go by the, sage doesn't mean a whole lot because there's culinary sage and there's salvias that are called sages. And then there are leucophyllums that are called sages, which is what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. So this is a beautiful Texas sage, Leucophyllum frutescens, and this is a plant that, and you can see from the picture a close-up of the leaves. The leaves are covered with little hairs. Those little hairs impart drought resistance to the plant. The plant resists drought, and it's able to get by on very lean soil conditions in terms of fertility and in terms of water. They like full sun, they like excellent drainage, and the Texas sage is a very vigorous grower. Therefore, it can tolerate very hard pruning in the springtime. So it can be pruned quite hard to maintain a dense form. Do you see how the plant form? Do you see how dense it is? It's not leggy. It has foliage all throughout it. When it blooms, it's going to have a good heavy bloom because of the way this plant is growing. Give these plenty of room, give them plenty of sunlight, and don't be afraid to prune it back hard after it's been in the ground for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. You'll probably want to prune it back very hard to maintain that density of foliage, stems, and flowers. And one thing that I didn't mention is there are many cultivars within this species of Texas sage, the Leucophyllum frutescens. There's compacta, green cloud, white cloud. There's a lot of different cultivars to pick from. This is another species of Leucophyllum. This is called Chihuahuan sage, and it has green foliage as opposed to the gray foliage we just looked at. It has this very spiky form, which is interesting and different. It likes full sun, good foliage, and there's a beautiful cultivar of this Leucophyllum labigatum called Summer Snow. And it is a very beautiful white blooming sage, so one that you might want to look for. These all need good drainage and they need full sunlight in order to do their best. And of course, they bloom in response to, well, the scientists tell me that they don't know exactly what they bloom in response to. They think it has to do with barometric pressure, but you don't have to have rainfall for these to bloom. This is one of those tricky nature things that the scientists don't have all the dynamics figured out as to what causes them to bloom. But when they bloom, they are a hallelujah plant. They are singing hallelujah, and they are just hard to beat by any other plant. They're quite delightful. So everybody needs some leucophyllums in their landscape. This is another leucophyllum. This is a dwarf one called Cimarron sage, and it looks quite different from from the other two sages that we've looked at. The leaf is small and cupped, and also covered in little white hairs. The leaf has more of a white appearance, and so there's a very dramatic difference between the flower color and the leaf color. So Cimarron sage is a super nice plant, and dwarf, so it doesn't those others get 5 and 6 feet tall and wide. This one's more in the 3-foot category. Now one of the things that I do fault, and it's not their fault, but anyway, the leucophyllums, because they have these hairs on their leaves, that also traps dust. And so sometimes they take on a dusty appearance. So Lord, send us rain. Send us a good rain periodically so that can wash the dust off of the leaves, and we can have that bright foliage color again. And of course, the flowers aren't dusty because the flowers come quickly and they fall quickly. So they're not around long enough to get dusty. But this is just a delightful, and you can see how, so let me just mention something at this point, which I should have mentioned when we were talking about dwarf shrubs. So when you're pruning, if you know that is a dwarf shrub, you should prune lightly, because dwarf shrubs by nature, they grow slowly and they don't recover from hard pruning as quickly as a large, vigorous growing shrub. And if you prune a dwarf shrub like a Cimarron sage, or like a pinky dwarf Indian hawthorn, or a dwarf Nandina, or a lot of these dwarf evergreen shrubs that you find in garden centers, if you prune those real hard in February, like I've been pushing and emphasizing, they will pout for 2 or 3 years. It'll take them that long to get over it. And sometimes they don't get over it. They die, or they just never fully recover. So you've got to know the characteristics of your plant before you prune it. So I've been pushing hard pruning, but now I'm going to switch to easy pruning. Know your plant. Know the speed in which it grows. If it only put on 1 or 2 inches last year, then you don't prune it unless it just needs to be pruned, or prune it lightly. So know your plant, know the characteristics of its growth before you decide how to handle the pruning of that plant. Okay, so back to pruning, hard pruning. So this is obviously one of those fast-growing leucophyllums. I don't even know what species it is. It's probably the Chihuahuan sage. And so it needs to be, okay, this brings me to another point. Another thing you need to know about pruning is, do the flower buds form on current season's growth or the previous season's growth? If the flowers form on current season's growth, that means you prune it during the dormant season. So late winter, February, that's when you prune it. But if the flowers occur on previous season's growth, you prune it after the flowers fade. So an example of that would be the Indian hawthorns. We had a beautiful pink bloom this spring on the Indian hawthorns. Those flower buds were actually set the previous season. So if you prune it hard in February, or if you prune it in February, you're going to be pruning off most of the flower buds and you won't have that beautiful spring bloom. So that's another thing you need to know about the shrub before you prune it, before you make a decision about pruning it. So knowing those things will help you make your pruning decisions. Now, sages, they bloom on summer growth, on the current growing season's wood. So, but they should be pruned in the dormant season, not during the growing season, which we see a lot. What happens is they grow vigorously through the growing season and they start getting too big for the beds, and they start hanging over the sidewalks and they start creating a problem. And so maintenance crews, because this happens more in commercial landscapes, they come through and they try to prune these wild things into a round circle or a square box or a duck or whatever shape they're going for. And so they're pruning off the flower buds. And what's left behind is maybe just a few little areas that escaped. And so when your plant blooms, it looks like a Holstein or a polka dot plant or something like that. So again, know when to bloom. So with Texas sage, you can, in the dormant season, you can prune out the oldest, woodiest stems. Or if you want, you can just say, okay, I'm going to prune 60% of the top back. I'm going to prune it back hard. And but anyway, again, you'll base your decisions on vigor and growth and where the flower buds form, previous season or current season. So this is how a Texas sage should look when it blooms. They're a wild thing, they're a free thing, and they don't take to being pruned into a round or a square shape. They just have their God-given shape, and they bloom best when they're given the proper amount of room to grow and to flower. Okay, we're moving on. Here we go. This is rosemary. This is upright rosemary. Upright rosemary is it has better winter hardiness than the trailing rosemary. It gets quite large. It's evergreen. It's very heat and sun tolerant. It can just take a tremendous amount of heat, and it's culinary. So you can go out and snip a few stems off of it and use it with your chicken or whatever it is that you're cooking. And also rosemary, I see it used in Central Texas quite a bit, and it's under live oak. So it tolerates a good deal of shade. So it's a very useful plant. It can get quite large. So sometimes you do have to beat it back with a broom in one hand and your loppers in another hand. And again, I would do that in February. I mean, that's the best time to do it, is in February. So it's a good, useful plant, but gets quite large. So watch its full size. Another really excellent shrub to use. This is a xeric shrub. It grows. This grows. Our district office, when I worked for the Extension Service, our district office is in Fort Stockton. So I would drive between Monahans and Fort Stockton, and this plant grows in the road cuts. It grows out of just pure rock, and it's a fresh green. It looks really vigorous and beautiful. It's fine textured, and it blooms and blooms and blooms through the summer. And you can do a tip shearing of this shrub in the summertime, and it just deadheads it, and it comes back with a lot of flowers. Does everybody understand deadheading? That's where you shear or you prune off the fading flower to prevent seed production so that that energy and growth goes into flowering. And so you can use that technique on flowering annuals, flowering perennials, on your shrubs and your roses and things like that. And it keeps things vigorous and growing. So, but skeleton leaf goldeneye is an excellent shrub in the landscape. It likes full sun, well-drained soils. You can just water it occasionally, and it's beautiful and excellent plant to have. We need to be using it more. It's a little hard to find. When you go to buy this at the nursery, it's not the prettiest plant on the table, but trust me, it's a beautiful plant in the landscape, and you will enjoy it in your landscape. Okay, now we're going to move into large shrubs. And again, you can see how a large shrub compares to the human scale. We can use them as large shrubs. We can use them as small trees. We can use them for mass planting, for screens, for hedging, for wildlife. I think there's some have outstanding foliage, flowers, fruit. They're all too big to use as foundation plantings, but often people will plant a crepe myrtle, a tree-formed crepe myrtle, as a foundation plant, and then it becomes too large and it's difficult to manage next to the home, and you're having to prune it too hard. And anyway, there's just some problems there. So in a very small landscape, let's say you have a 0 lot line landscape, large shrubs could be your trees because you don't have the amount of space to use as in a larger landscape. Okay, so one of the large shrubs that does extremely well here, very beautiful plant, is evergreen sumac. It's evergreen. It has dark green leaves. In the wintertime, it takes on a burgundy color. In the spring, it has these small, creamy white, waxy looking flowers that is good for foraging insects. And then later in the growing season, they form these little fruit, and birds will feed on the fruit. This plant can be used as a large shrub, or it can be trained into a small tree or a multi-trunk tree. It grows in full sun or part shade. It's extremely versatile in soils. It's very versatile in limited light situations. And so it's just a really excellent plant to utilize in the landscape. If you go to McKinney Trail here in Odessa, and you go at the, that would be the west entrance, there's a parking lot there and playground area. Just as you get on the path, there is an evergreen sumac that's been trained up into a small tree there. So you can get an idea of how it actually looks if you're not familiar with the plant. Another really useful, extremely useful, we use this. This is very popular in landscapes, very popular in the nursery trade, and a great plant to put in your home landscape or public landscapes, and that's Texas mountain laurel. It is evergreen. It has beautiful foliage, shiny and clean foliage, very nice. And in the springtime, it blooms with these wisteria-like blooms that are highly fragrant. They smell like grape Kool-Aid or grape chewing gum. And the color of the flower ranges from white to dark purple. And it's just a very delightful plant. It can be trained, it can be used as a large shrub, or it can be trained into a multi-trunk tree, or just have 2 or 3 trunks. Now, since I'm talking about training, whenever you're training a shrub into a small tree form shape, a good rule of thumb is to keep the top 2/3 of the plant in leafy canopy. So this part should be the top 2/3 of the plant should be in leafy canopy. This one's been over pruned just a tiny bit. And then the bottom third, 1/3, should be stem tissue. So if you use that ratio, actually you can use that ratio anytime you're training any kind of a tree. The bottom third should be kept in trunk tissue, the top 2/3 kept in leafy canopy. And that way, that's a healthy ratio. That is also visually a correct ratio. And so as the tree grows, you know, of course, you just maintain that ratio when you're pruning it in the dormant season. Does that make sense? So it's a rule of thumb to always use with training small trees, any kind of tree, any kind of shade tree. So you gradually prune it, and you don't prune it up to 6 feet from the get-go, from the time you plant it in the ground, because that would end up only leaving a tuft of growth up here, and then this long trunk that's vulnerable to sun and injury and wind and all the forces. You let it be leafy, and then you just gradually remove all the lower foliage as the tree grows. Okay, so now I'm sure I've muddied the waters plenty there. But bottom line, Texas mountain laurel is an excellent small tree. It'll grow in full sun, and it will grow in partial shade, which makes it very valuable in home landscapes, since we always end up with a lot of shade. So it has to have good drainage. Once it's established, it'll get by on limited amounts of water, just occasional watering. Too much water, the foliage will turn yellow, and it won't perform very well. There's a mountain laurel that has silvery foliage. One cultivar is called Silver Peso, or just the silver form is called Silver Mountain Laurel. And so the leaves are covered with little white hairs. So this mountain laurel is even more drought tolerant than the green leaf mountain laurel. Also, there's a couple of advantages to these silver mountain laurels, which you don't see very often. We planted one at the compost garden, and I'm not sure if it's there anymore. I can't remember. But, well, the compost garden's not there anymore, but some of the trees are still there. But that's on West 42nd Street at the Recycle Time Machine. There's some trees there. That used to be one of our demonstration gardens, and we have some interesting trees planted down there. And this was one of them, but I can't remember if it's there anymore. But the silver mountain laurel has a couple of good advantages. One, the foliage is covered with the white hairs, so that makes it more drought tolerant. Also, there is a dramatic difference between the flower color and the leaf color. So the flowers really stand out against this whitish foliage behind it. And then there's one other really good advantage. Since these leaves are covered in little white hairs, there's a worm that gets on mountain laurels that feeds on the foliage and can do quite a bit of damage. But evidently that worm doesn't like this the hairs of the leaves on this white form or the silver form as much as it does the green form. So that worm is called a sophra worm, and it's quite a bit of it. And you can see it feeds on the foliage, and it'll take all the new growth off. And it's as long as your mountain laurel is small, just inspect it periodically, and when you see these worms on it, you can I use the pick and squish method. Now, if you're not a fan of picking and squishing, you could prune and put them in a bucket of soapy water. Or if your mountain laurel is tall and you can no longer reach to pick and squish or prune or whatever, you can spray BT, which is a biological control for the immature forms of moths and butterflies. Or you can use spinosad, which is also a very good method of controlling immature forms of moths and butterflies, and also very safe. And so be on the lookout for the Sephora worm, because they can feed on all the new growth. Okay, so now we're going to move into ornamental grasses. And the ornamental grasses are, when I first got into horticulture, the only ornamental grass that was around was pampas grass. That one right there. And if you've ever worked around pampas grass very much, you know it's not a user-friendly plant. It has sharp leaf margins and it can cut you, and it's irritating and stuff like that. And it gets too big for the home landscape. It's a great plant for large public landscapes. But anyway, you can see from this slide that some ornamental grasses are very short and petite, and some are knee high, and some are hip high, and there's just lots of different ornamental grasses. And ornamental grasses are super easy to grow. They are super beautiful. They have very few problems. And so we're going to talk about just a few of those grasses. Ornamental grasses provide beautiful movement to the landscape, and beautiful form. They reflect the light beautifully. They're with backlighting or with any kind of sunlight. They reflect that lighting, and they're beautiful. They're easy to grow. They provide unique qualities, musical, entertaining qualities to the landscape, and they look good through the winter. So you don't prune them until February. So don't be pruning them till February if you can help it. But here you can see from this picture that this line of ornamental grasses repeat the design line of the bed, which is a very beautiful use of the plant. And it has an evergreen shrub behind it, and then it has this beautiful stucco wall behind that. And so just a lot of beautiful things going on in this slide right here. Okay, so the first ornamental grass we're going to talk about is a blue grama, and there's a blue grama selection called Blonde Ambition. Blonde Ambition is quite a bit larger than the species. It's a good 1 to 2 feet tall, or maybe not quite 2 feet, but it's 18, 20 inches tall, and it's a blue grama on steroids, and it is very fine textured, beautiful. Blue grama grows on our roadsides, so it's native to much of the Great Plains area of the United States, and so it'll get by on very little. And so Blonde Ambition is very beautiful. The new growth is chartreuse in the spring, and then soon after it begins to bloom with these little seed heads that look like false eyelashes, blonde false eyelashes. And it's very beautiful plant, and it's small, so it fits into the modest size landscape quite well. It likes full sun, well-drained soils. It likes, it can get by in partial shade. So it's a really, really nice, fun plant to grow. So if you haven't grown it, you might look for that this spring. One of the ones that's very popular is Gulf Coast Muley. Some people call it purple muley or pink muley, but it's a Muhlenbergia, and that species has several excellent ornamental grasses that you can find in the nursery trade. So it blooms in October. Up until then, it's sort of ordinary looking. Not too showy, whereas some ornamental grasses have several seasons of beauty. But the Gulf Coast Muley is spectacular. Anything it doesn't provide during the growing season, it makes up for in October when it blooms. It's very beautiful, and it's beautiful with backlighting. As you can see from well, this isn't backlighting. This is just sunlight, West Texas sunlight. And it's quite beautiful. Now this is a hybrid cross, they think, between the Gulf Coast Muley and the Lindheimer Muley, and it's called Pink Flamingo. And this is a beautiful grass. It has characteristics of both parents, and it's not as dramatically colored as Gulf Coast Muley, and it's not quite as large as the Lindheimer Muley. It's really just a beautiful combination of characteristics of those two muleys. And this one's a little slower to get established, or at least my experience with it was, but I did have it under a shade tree, and I probably wasn't taking diligent care of it. But it is one that I would encourage you to take a look at as well. It's a combination of two of really fine muleys. This is the Lindheimer Muley, so it's one of the parents of the Pink Flamingo that we just saw. And you can see it's fine textured. The foliage color is sort of blue-green, and the form is very beautiful. And this plant will grow in full hot blazing sun, or it will take deciduous shade. It'll grow in deciduous shade and do quite well. And it blooms in August. So in August, it begins to develop these seed heads that are very beautiful. And one thing that I've noticed about them is that in the morning, the seed head is relaxed and open because there's some humidity in the air. But then as the day goes by and the humidity level goes down, well, that seed head contracts, and it's more narrow. And so it changes throughout the day. I love it when plants have all these different things going on throughout the day, and different characteristics. So Lindheimer is quite large. So when it's in bloom, it's at least 4 feet tall, maybe a little bit taller, and the clump slowly gets bigger every year. Now, a lot of these grasses, you can dig them up in the spring, and you can divide them and set the divisions out, so you can, increase your number of that species. Now, this grass is I think grasses are hard to dig up and divide and that kind of thing. So sometimes what I do is I'll take a pruning saw, and I do this in the springtime. So now, speaking of pruning, so in February, all of these warm season grasses, you need to prune them back. You cut them back just horizontal to the ground, and you cut them back to just within inches of the crown, about 2 to 3 inches high. You just cut them straight back. And you can do that with hedge trimmers or hand pruners or with pruning saws. And once the grasses get really big, there's a benefit to taking a short section of rope and tying the top of your grass real tight. Just gathering it up like a ponytail and tie it off real tight. Or sometimes I use duct tape, or you can use a bungee cord, or I'm sure y'all have probably better ways than I do. So be sure and share that information with me. But anyway, it saves on the cleanup. But so that would maybe be a good time to propagate or soon after to propagate or to take a cutting. I guess that's how a root section of these plants. So I just take a pruning saw, and I just cut a notch out of the side of this mound of grass, and I do this with an old pruning saw, one that has the tip broken or whatever, and then I just transplant that little section to wherever I want to start a new Lindheimer's Muley or Gulf Coast Muley or whatever. So that's the lazy girl's way of propagating Lindheimer's Muley. Okay, here's a couple of more grasses that we can grow in this area. The one on the top, or the mid on the left screen, left picture mid screen, that is Carl Forrester featherweed grass. And it's a really attractive and popular grass. But it doesn't do as well out here as a lot of these other grasses that I'm talking about. The grubworms like it, and they'll kill it. I had 3 planted in 3 different locations in my landscape one year, and it took me a long time to figure out what was wrong with them. I just noticed they were declining and more, and finally I started digging around, and I discovered they had grubworms, or one of them did. And then soon after, the other one followed, and then I had one in the front yard, same thing, grubworm. So and they don't always bloom real good here. So I have not found that they're that great of a plant, but they are a popular plant, and they're all the nursery, wholesale growers propagate it and stuff. But anyway, the grass on the bottom, it does great. This is little blue stem. And so you can see how upright, fine textured, and how blue the foliage is during the growing season. And then in the fall, on the right-hand side of your screen, it turns this reddish color, and the plant becomes a little bit wispy at that stage. And the seed head shines in the light. So it's very beautiful, and it's very underutilized. And there are several different cultivars of little blue stem. There's one called Standing Ovation, and there's several others. I can't remember the names of them, but in the nursery trade now. And so you might look for little blue stem. It's not used very much, but it's a very nice ornamental grass. Okay, so now I have flowering perennials, but I'm not going to do the flowering perennials because I want us to get to the trees. So bear with me for a minute. I'm going to escape, or I'm going to get out of. Oh no, wait! Can't do that. Let's see. Or I don't know what I'm doing here. Oops. Okay, well, just bear with me, and I'll get down to the trees here. If you have any questions, be sure and let Jeanette know.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Someone said, do you have a book that could outline these plants that you're recommending?
Yes, there is an excellent book. And I mean, we used to keep it in the office, but we may not have it anymore, but you can get it online. In fact, there's an electronic copy of it. Let's see, I'm looking for my copy so I can give you the exact. I can't give you I have to be looking at it to tell you the exact name of the title, but it is it's a collaborative publication by the City of Austin, the Texas AgriLife Extension Service, and a few other Master Gardeners and some other agencies. And it's part of the Grow Green series. So if you go online and Google Grow Green, native and adapted landscape plants, this book will pop up. And so you can do the online copy, or you can order a copy of it from the City of Austin. And that is an excellent reference for these plants and many other plants. And almost all of them do extremely well here. And so it's a very good book. And it's a booklet. It's a soft-bound booklet form. And honestly, there may still be some copies around the Extension office. Maybe the Ector County Extension office might have them.
I can look for them. I just found it online and I linked it in the chat box.
Great. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well done. That is a good book. So I highly recommend it. The pictures are not wonderful in it, but the information in that book, it tells you the common name, botanical name, whether it's evergreen or deciduous, whether it's native or introduced, what the key season of interest is, like when its peak bloom is, whether it's wildlife friendly, whether it's deer resistant, whether it's butterflies. And then in the very last column, which I find extremely helpful, it gives you maintenance recommendations, like how far to prune it back, when to prune it back, information about some cultivars. So it's a very useful book, and I would recommend that you use that, as well as many other books. There's many books that are helpful and useful. For Neil Sperry has a good book, has some good books. There, Greg Grant, Bill Welch. There's many people that have written publications that are extremely useful. But I find that one a quick, easy reference. Any of y'all can get it by just following that link that Jeanette sent you.
Great.
Okay, so we're gonna, I'm sorry?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see. Now, are y'all seeing trees?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So trees are just, now most of our trees don't grow this tall. This is the redwood forest in California. So but although we do have some tall trees, but I had a tree in my last landscape that I probably have trees in the landscape I have now that are that tall. But anyway, most of our trees don't get quite that tall here, but we're West Texas. We have limited rainfall. We have conditions where trees in the small, medium, and the large tree category grow. But anyway, so trees have a tremendous number of benefits. Cooling shade is one of the #1 reasons for growing trees. They're like giant air conditioners, and they create the walls and the ceilings of our outdoor rooms. We have these outdoor living spaces around our homes, and trees help to complete those outdoor living spaces by providing a ceiling or a roof over our heads. They also create a wonderful habitat for birds and the dreaded squirrels and tree squirrels and all these other creatures that live in the urban landscape, or you may be in a country landscape. They filter out dust and pollutants, they buffer noises, and they are the all-important bones for our landscapes. So some of us are lucky enough to get to plan where our trees go. Many of us inherit the trees we get because, as you know, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. But since we can't do that, we have to use today, and we can make some good decisions with where to plant trees and what species to plant. So I hope to be able to tell you some good tree species to plant in your home landscape. So I'm going to start off in the small tree category, and I'm going to start with Texas redbud. So used to the only redbud you could buy was the eastern redbud. Well, there are species that do much better here, such as the Texas redbud, and it is a beautiful tree, and they bloom in February and March, and they have redbuds have beautiful foliage, and they have this beautiful spring bloom. So they bloom on flower buds that were formed in the previous growing season. They bloom before the leaves begin to emerge, so that makes for a dramatic bloom. When you have leaves and flowers coming out at the same time, they sort of compete for attention. But when you have a bloom, then you have the leaves emerge. You have a very dramatic spring bloom. And so redbuds fall into that category. They have these pinky purple blooms, and the blooms are edible. The blooms can be used in salads or to garnish desserts and stuff like that. They have a peppery flavor, so they're good in salads. And they're followed by little bean pods, little flat bean pods that are usually sort of reddish in color. The leaves of the Texas redbud are thick and glossy and green. So when you see a leaf that's highly glossy, that means it has leaves have a cuticle layer that covers the leaf surface, and it's a layer of wax. It's a waxy layer. So the thicker that waxy layer is, the shinier the leaf is, and the more drought resistant it is. So another characteristic for a plant that tolerates or resists drought. And that's the Texas redbud. They are small trees. They get 12 to 20 feet tall, and they are very excellent for home landscapes. This is a cultivar of Texas redbud called Oklahoma, and it has a deeper purple, pink flower, and it's a dramatic tree. It's a real pretty tree. The foliage is gorgeous, so that's a nice one to look for. There's also there's a Mexican redbud, and it has even smaller leaves than the Texas redbud. So let me back up. Eastern redbud has big heart-shaped leaves that are very thin, so it's subject to scorching, and it doesn't hold up to our growing conditions like the Texas redbud. So the Texas redbud the leaves are smaller and thicker, and then the Mexican redbud has even smaller, even thicker leaves and shinier. Do you see how shiny those leaves are? And they have even a twinkly characteristic. So it's a beautiful tree, and it's even more drought tolerant, even more heat tolerant than the Texas redbud. The redbuds are also, I forgot to mention this, but they're understory trees. So they can grow under deciduous shade trees. So they can take shadier conditions, and they do quite well. And the Mexican redbud has the same dramatic spring bloom that the Texas and the Eastern redbuds have. It wants to be more shrubby, but you can train it into usually a multi-trunk shape. It doesn't have to be. You can sometimes train it into a single trunk, but it really wants to be a shrub. So usually a multi-trunk tree is better format for it. These are hard to find. They're very hard to find in the nursery trade, so good luck. You can find them, but and I don't know why. I don't know if it's because they're not as popular or what, but they're hard to find in the nursery trade. But beautiful trees, and I encourage you to look for them, and smaller trees. The TxDOT, Texas Department of Transportation, have planted these on our roadsides. So you can see these around Midland and around Odessa along the interstate. One of the problems with redbuds is that they are subject to soft brown scale insects. So these little insects don't look like insects. They look like a part of the tree. They look like a bud, or, they just look like some innocent part of the tree itself, but they can be very damaging, and as their populations build up, they can be very damaging. So you might want to check your trees right now, and they get on more than just redbuds. They get on red oaks, they get on Mexican buckeye, they get on lots of trees, and even some shrubs, and they're very damaging. But this is the adult female, and she lays eggs underneath this sort of shell-like structure, and in the spring the eggs hatch, and the scale is in a crawler stage, and they move up towards the new growth, and that's when they're most susceptible to an insecticide or a dormant oil or an insecticidal soap, or whatever treatment you're gonna, or even a systemic treatment. So be on the lookout for these because they can really wreck your trees. Now we're going to take a look at desert willows. Desert willows are in the small tree, kind of ooching into the medium tree category, but they are lovely trees, very well adapted, that once they're established, they can get by on rainfall, although almost everything does better if you'll give it a monthly or a bi-monthly or twice monthly irrigation. But they bloom spring through fall. Very, very lovely orchid-like blooms, and they come in a lot of different colors: white, pink, purple, burgundy colors. Lovely, lovely plants. They have, they're not related to weeping willows or globe willows or any of those willows that are short-lived and have a multitude of problems. They tend to be fast-growing trees, and they tend to be multi-trunk trees, although they can be trained to a single trunk. And so they're lovely. And again, TxDOT has used them along our roadsides. This is one of their plantings combined with Texas sage. And what a beautiful, beautiful planting that is, that gets by on its own. They don't prune it. They don't water it. They just, once they're established, they have to water them for the first 3 years or so, but then they just kind of let them get by on their own. And you can see how lovely that tree is. Also, desert willows tend to develop very beautiful silhouettes. So in the wintertime, when they've dropped their leaves, they have these sort of very interesting, contorted looking silhouettes. So they are a lovely seasonal tree, and easy to grow and easy to use in our landscapes. Honey mesquite is another really nice small tree that we can use in our landscapes. And mesquites have a bad reputation because they are very prolific in overgrazed and poorly managed landscape, or not landscapes, but rangeland. And so they're a problem for ranchers and large land owners who are trying to manage their prolific growth. But in the landscape, they're beautiful. Fine textured foliage, fine textured shade, easy to train them. They do have thorns, but there's a thornless cultivar, probably a couple on the market, and there's some seedless forms on the market. One of the thornless is called Maverick. So they're very useful also in the home landscape. This is a sumac called Prairie Flameleaf Sumac. Has very fine textured, it's deciduous, so it drops its leaves. It flowers in the spring, and then it produces these clusters of fruit. The birds and other wildlife take advantage of the fruit. And this picture on the right shows the fall foliage. And the foliage turns beautiful, deep burgundy colors. So you get great fall color. Now, one of the bad things about this plant is that if you disturb the root system, it'll form a thicket, and so you'll get you'll have a thicket of sumac instead of a single tree. But still, they're useful in the home landscape. This is Mexican buckeye, and this is an underutilized little tree. It's a small tree. We don't use it very much, but it does well here. And it wants to be a multi-trunk small tree. It blooms in the spring at the same time it's leafing out. So the spring bloom is not as dramatic as like a red bud, but it's a very tough, tolerant tree. It has good yellow fall color in the fall, and it's one of those trees that's susceptible to the soft brown scale. So you need to kind of keep an eye on that. It's one that will get by on rainfall, native whatever our rainfall is. So it's an excellent little tree. Here it is in a home landscape where it's been trained up, and this is a very xeric kind of landscape that it's in. And you see you can tell by the scale of the table and the trash can, the size of the tree. Lovely tree. Then these are very xeric plants that I'm showing you. This is Chisos rosewood. It's native in the Big Bend, and it's evergreen, and it has very fine, narrow evergreen leaves. And it is, once it's established, it would get by on rainfall. And you can see that the bottom of this tree could be cleaned up, and it could be sort of trained into a small multi-trunk tree. Its cousin is the Arizona rosewood. The leaf on it is a little, quite a bit wider, thicker, longer, darker green, and so it's a lusher looking plant. Both of them bloom in the spring with these small white blooms, and so they're super useful in the home landscape. The Arizona rosewood, the one we're looking at right now, this is also native in the Big Bend. This plant has been planted in our area, and it has proven to be a very useful small evergreen tree. And it seems to grow quite, to me, it seems to grow pretty fast. And so it's underutilized, extremely valuable, and I would encourage you to look for this one. And I do see this in the nursery trade. In fact, I think I know where there's a 5-gallon bucket setting right now. And it, like I said, it looks like heck in the bucket, but if you'll take it home and plant it, it'll very quickly respond to being in the ground and start growing and do well. This is a common small tree in our landscapes, and this is called Vitex, or sometimes it's called summer lilac, Texas lilac. It's got several common names, and I think I neglected to mention to y'all, but yeah, I started to talk about it. Common names don't mean much. So if you really want to make sure you're getting the plant that you want, you need to operate in the botanical name. So Vitex is the genus, and Agnus castus is the species. And that way and then sometimes there are cultivar names. So the biggest picture here is actually of a pink Vitex. So there's pink Vitex, white Vitex, purple Vitex, lavender blue Vitex. So there's all these different color breaks, but purple is the most common one. And then there are some cultivars of Vitex that you'll find. One of them is called Montrose Purple, Shoal Creek Vitex. I think that's it. Anyway, there's some different cultivar names, so that's one that was vegetatively propagated, and it has those very same characteristics, and you can be guaranteed that it's going to exhibit those characteristics. So if you want a specific plant, you need to really, be aware of the botanical name. And now, just because you go to the nursery and the nursery has that tag on that plant, unfortunately does not guarantee that plant was tagged correctly at the wholesale nursery or the intermediate nursery or whatever. Unfortunately, things get, stuff gets confused every once in a while. That's not a common thing, but I do see it. Anyway, Vitex is a great small deciduous tree. It's a rapid grower. It has very few problems. Now, we did see a problem with it this year, and we saw it on several things. As y'all will recall, we had an unexpected, very dramatic, low, first freeze was in October, and it went down to 18. And we hadn't had any freezes prior to that. So plants hadn't hardened, and they weren't prepared for cold. They weren't going dormant. They were just still in the growing zone. And we had this dramatic, early, hard freeze. 18 degrees is low for us, certainly for a first freeze. So in the tops of our Vitex, we have lots of deadwood. In the tops of our crepe myrtles, we have lots of deadwood. And probably in some our oleanders and probably a lot of other things I'm not thinking of. But anyway, that doesn't commonly happen. So Vitex doesn't have very many problems. It's very drought tolerant, very heat tolerant. I don't know of any insect and disease problems. I haven't seen that in this plant. So it's a great plant to have in the landscape. Okay, now we're going to move into medium and large trees. So we're kind of getting into the home run, and that's good because I've talked almost for 2 hours now. But this is Chinese pistache, and this is a picture taken in the fall. So the summer foliage is green and lush of Chinese pistache, and it's an excellent medium-sized shade tree for our home landscapes. And now with this is an ornamental pistache. It's the same genus as the one that produces the tasty nuts that we love. But this is an ornamental, but the females do produce a fruit. And that fruit is just a cluster of little berries, and those berries germinate readily. So we get seedling Chinese pistache trees all the time. Now, and the females are not, so there's separate male and female trees. So there are trees that produce the male flower, and there's female trees that produce the female flowers. And so the male flowers provide the pollen, and which pollinates the female flowers. And anyway, we have a seed crop. If you get a male, the males are a lot cleaner. They have better branching structure. They're not as open and willowy looking as the females are. But then a lot of times they don't have as dramatic fall color because the females go into the fall maturing this berry crop, and they're under stress, and therefore their fall color is more dramatic than the male. But the males do have a better, they have better branching and neater appearance, and they don't have the berries. The berries are a nuisance, in the home landscape. But anyway, these are good, tough trees, and they will get by on rainfall once they're established. They don't like overwatering. These trees are kind of willowy when they're young. They look willowy and undisciplined, and they're kind of hard to know how to prune. But even without pruning, they'll generally develop a nice, full, round canopy and look good. So the Chinese pistache is an excellent tree to plant in your home landscape. Chinkapin oak. This is a very nice oak tree that has very good branching pattern. It once it's established, it can get by on rainfall or very little irrigation. All oaks have acorns. All oaks have catkins. But some oaks are messier than other oaks. But so this is a little cleaner an oak than, like, say, live oak. But it's a good, tough tree, handsome foliage. We planted one of these at the compost garden, which is at the Recycle Time Machine on West 42nd Street in Odessa. So if you're unsure of Chinkapin oak, go look at that tree. It's a good quality. It's a nice tree. It's turned into a nice tree, not really because of anything we did, just because it has good genetics and just turns into a good tree. Medium-sized tree, gets 40 to 50 feet tall at maturity. And then there's the bur oak, and there's also a bur. In fact, this is the bur oak at the Recycle Time Machine. So it's just a good, vigorous tree. It has very large leaves, and it has very large acorns. They are ankle twisters. So you might think about that if you're trying to decide on an oak to plant, that they do have these very large acorns. And in one way, that's an advantage, and probably in another way, that's a disadvantage. It's probably easier to clean up the acorn crop on a bur oak than it is the little acorns on a red oak or a live oak. But anyway, you can see this is an extremely handsome tree, vigorous, healthy, easy to grow. These are easy to propagate from seed, but you need to harvest the seed very early in the fall when you can just pick the acorn out of the cup, plant it immediately, and you'll get good germination. Oaks have the seed has a short viability, so the seed does not last very long. So you've got to harvest it quickly, plant it quickly, and it'll germinate quickly. This is the Monterey oak, or sometimes called Mexican white oak. It's Quercus polymorpha because it has different leaf shapes all over the tree at the same time. It needs good drainage. Once it's established, it will get by on rainfall. And there's some good examples of Monterey oak in Midland. It's on the West Loop at 191 and Loop 250 on all 4 quadrants of that interchange. There are 4 good examples of Monterey oak, so you can see what they look like at this time of the year. I think they're kind of slow to grow. You have to be really patient for them to get some size on them. But other than that, they're really great trees. And of course, there's the southern live oak, and then there's also the escarpment oak, which is native more out in our part of the world. And they're tough trees. They're beautiful trees. They're extremely tolerant of really tough conditions. They get quite large. The Virginiana gets larger than the Quercus fusiformis, or the escarpment oak. And they're too large for most home landscapes, and they can be quite messy because they're evergreen, or they're semi-evergreen, or they drop their leaves whenever they start putting on their new leaves in the spring. And so there's this long period of dropping leaves. There's this long period of dropping catkins, which is the male flower. Then they drop their acorns in the fall, and then they get aphids, and aphids drop honeydew. And so they can be a very challenging tree. So don't plant them next to your driveway, your patio, your swimming pool, your front door, because they will be a nuisance to you. But other than that, they're tough and beautiful, but they are too big for the home landscape typically. Western soapberry is another native tree to this area, and it's okay in the lawn because if it's in a bed, it tends to send up sprouts, or it roots sprouts, and you get a colony. They have excellent fall color. They're a deciduous tree. They're extremely tough. I really like them. Let's see. So you can see good examples of these near the Midland County Extension Office. So they're just east of the Midland County Extension Office. They're between the highway divide there, and there's some really beautiful examples of them in that landscape. And there's on the way to Kermit, they're all along, so they're common, and they're really good trees. Now, one problem they do have, sorry. One problem they do have is that they set a fruit crop, a little berry, translucent yellow berry, and there's an insect called the red shoulder bug, or box elder bug, that gets on them. And anyway, they're a nuisance around your home because they want to live with you. Where you live in the winter, they want to be, and they become a big nuisance. So that is a problem with that tree. Okay, now a very clean, good, excellent tree for home landscapes and public landscapes is the cedar elm. And elms have a bad rap because the elm tree that our communities were founded with that's the Siberian elm tree, which is an elm tree that doesn't have good characteristics. It has weak wood, it's short-lived, it has a lot of problems, it has an elm leaf beetle, it has just a lot of bad problems. But the cedar elm has excellent qualities and characteristics. Strong branching. When we had that bad ice storm, and it's a few years ago, we had a really bad ice storm on New Year's Day, that this tree didn't break up at all. I mean, it was one of the few trees that didn't have any breaking limbs in it. Now, it is a little susceptible to mistletoe. Every once in a while, the elm leaf beetle will be a problem on it, but not very often. But and it's not a slow grower. I said it was a slow grower, but it really is a moderate grower. It has a moderate growth rate, and it has small leaves. It does bloom, but it blooms in the fall, and the seed is small, and so it's a lot cleaner than the Siberian elm tree. It has good fall color. You see this yellow fall color, so it's an excellent tree for us to be growing, and actually it may even be a little faster than moderate growth rate. I think it might be considered fast, but anyway, a tree that I would encourage you to look at. Its cousin is the lacebark elm. So the lacebark elm is a fast-growing elm tree, also a fairly clean tree, because it also blooms in the fall, and it's a small seed and a pretty clean drop. One of the nice things about the lacebark elm, which actually its real name is Chinese elm, but people incorrectly called the Siberian elm Chinese elm. So it got a bad rap, and they couldn't market it through the trade. So they changed its name to lacebark elm, which is the characteristic of the trunk. As it matures, it's an exfoliating bark, and it sheds these little pieces of bark that are sort of they look like puzzle pieces to me, but it looks lacy to somebody, and so it's called the lacebark elm, and it's a very nice tree and one to consider for your home landscape. So I think I've gotten through all of the trees that I was going to talk about. So there are many other plants that I would love to talk about, and I would love to show you, but there's so little time, and I'll probably worn you out. I'm sure everybody's gone to sleep by now. So thank you so much for your very kind attention and for this opportunity to visit with y'all.
Thank you.